The Hayes Advantage with Kathleen Hayes.
William Isaac joins us now. He's Senior Managing Director of FTI Consulting, and he serves as Global Head of FTI Consulting's Financial Institutions Group. And even more to the point, he was the head of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation during the banking crisis of the 1980s. In fact, he served at the FDIC under Presidents Carter and Reagan from 1978 through 1985. And we want to talk about the one-year anniversary of Dodd-Frank. Bill, welcome back.
Kathleen, nice to be back.
So are you making a cake and putting on a one-year candle to blow out?
I surely am. As you know, Dodd-Frank is my favorite law.
Right. And we have that knot, big red circle line through it.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of Dodd-Frank. It's in my opinion, it's the worst financial law that's ever been passed in this country, and at least for a long, long time.
Well, in your book, which again, if people want to go back and put together the pieces of the financial crisis, and I think each book of the good books you read does that for you, because everyone was in charge of a certain part or experienced a certain part. Your book, Senseless Panic: How Washington Failed America, is how we rushed to do things like TARP. And then, of course, rushed to put through this quote-unquote financial overhaul. And the question is, are we really any safer? Are the banks any less too big to fail, et cetera?
No, Dodd-Frank did not repair anything that needed to be. I shouldn't say that. That's too strong. It repaired very little of what was wrong with the system, and it certainly didn't address any of the major issues. For example, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the housing crisis were a major part of the calamity we just went through, and Dodd-Frank didn't touch those things. We have a broken financial regulatory system. It's badly fragmented and politicized, and Dodd-Frank didn't change it at all. We have the same old regulators doing the same old things, and that hasn't been fixed. We have a highly consolidated and concentrated financial system where the five largest institutions control over 50% of the banking system, and Dodd-Frank didn't do anything to correct that. You can't end too big to fail when you have five firms that hold that much of the system, and it's dangerous. It's a concentration of risk that is quite dangerous. So no, I don't believe that Dodd-Frank did anything to meaningfully reform the system. It would not have prevented the last crisis and won't prevent the next one.
Randy Kroszner was just on the show, former Federal Reserve Board governor, and of course he was selected for a seat on that board because of his expertise in regulating financial institutions, financial crises, etc. I asked him how he would grade Dodd-Frank, and he said he would give it an incomplete. And I guess that's I think the best grade now, because to a certain extent we don't know what it's going to achieve. So many agencies have to push off these deadlines for writing the regulations. Seems to me that just gives the lobbyists all the more chance to get in there and try to push things back. What are we going to end up with?
Well, Randy is kinder than I would be to give it an incomplete. If everybody had everything done that needs to get done under Dodd-Frank, we'd be in worse shape than we are right now with it only partially done. Dodd-Frank basically is, well, first of all, it's 2,500 pages long. That tells you something about the law right there. The Glass-Steagall Act, which was enacted in 1934 in response to the Great Depression, did two major things. It created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and it separated commercial banking and from investment banking, sort of separated Main Street from Wall Street. And it was 50 pages long. This major piece of reform legislation was only 50 pages long. Dodd-Frank is 2,500 pages long. Most of Dodd-Frank is telling regulators to issue new regulations, and they're going to be issuing some 300 or 400 new regulations. You know they got to be 10, 20 pages each. So we're looking at thousands and thousands of pages of new regulations. For what end? I mean, we haven't changed the basic structure. that got us into trouble. We haven't changed the regulatory structure. We haven't changed the housing situation. We haven't changed the structure of banking. It's very, very concentrated. What has Dodd-Frank made better? It's just heaped thousands of pages of new regulations. I'm mostly worried, Kathleen, about the destruction of our community banking system. I don't know how the community banks survive this, and nobody seems to care.
So let's drill down on that a bit. What is it about Dodd-Frank that is going to destroy the community banks? And we have small business people on and community bankers too. And many of them will tell you that frequently the kind of business a small business person is doing doesn't even warrant a big bank's attention, let alone a loan. So this is so important. Small businesses doing the big job creation the last couple of years too. Why is Dodd-Frank bad for community banks?
Well, first of all, they're going to have to deal with thousands of pages of new regulations, which they can't do. I'm chairman of Fifth Third Bancorp, which is, of course, one of the larger banks in the country. And Dodd-Frank's a pain for a bank like Fifth Third. It's an expense, but Fifth Third has millions of customers and can pass those costs along, and of course can hire whatever people it needs to hire to come into compliance with all these new laws and regulations. A small bank can't do that. They just don't have the people, and they don't have the number of customer transactions to pass along those costs. Secondly, the Collins Amendment, which was Senator Collins put an amendment on Dodd-Frank that required the banks to stop using trust preferred stock as part of their capital structure. Again, not a problem for a bank like Fifth Third because it has lots of sources of capital. But for the small community banks, trust preferred stock was one of the most prominent sources of capital they had. Where are the small banks going to get their capital now that they can't issue this trust preferred stock? So I think Dodd-Frank was very, very harmful to the community banks. And I would tell you, we all know that most jobs in this country are created by small businesses. And if we don't have small businesses being served by small banks in thousands of communities around this country, we're in trouble.
But we also know that probably the donations from the financial services industry into Congress and the White House, from the big banks dwarf anything that comes from community banks, and presumably lobbyists help write this stuff, and that's what you end up with. The community banks just don't have a voice. They don't have the big pockets.
Most people that I think that's true, and most people that I talk to and whose opinions I respect believe that we have about 7,000 community banks right now. That's banks under $1 billion in size. And most people that I talk to believe, as I do, that number, if we don't do something soon to help these community banks, we're going to have about half that number in another 5 to 10 years. And I don't want to lose half the community banks in this country, and I don't want to see that much more consolidation in our banking system. So I think this is an urgent priority that we need to get addressed.
Will this be addressed when people talk about Dodd-Frank on the Hill tomorrow?
Probably not.
If you could sit down on a panel and question people, Bill, what would you be asking them? What would you ask Ben Bernanke?
I'm not sure there's much I would ask Ben about Dodd-Frank, because it's the law, and pretty much he's going to have to implement what the Congress has told him to implement. So I don't think he's primarily the issue. I guess one thing I would ask him is, if you were advising us, sir, what would you recommend we change? If you had a free hand, how would you write this law? How would you change it? It'd be interesting to see what his response would be if he responded to it with honesty. If he were frank about it, I'd really be interested to get his views of it. My guess is, though, that he wouldn't feel comfortable giving a frank response.
Well, indeed, and I think there's some economists and others I've spoken to who feel that the Fed felt very much under pressure and very threatened during the whole hammering out of that legislation, and that they did everything they could behind the scenes and up in Washington or down in Washington to keep their power as a bank regulator?
Well, there's no question. The Fed was playing defense throughout the Dodd-Frank proceedings. You recall that the Fed was taking a lot of criticism for it allowing this crisis to develop in the first place, not getting on top of things earlier, and having promoted highly pro-cyclical things like the Basel capital accords, which were, I don't want to get too technical, but basically they didn't really force our banks to maintain high enough capital standards. And we had these loan loss reserving policies where banks were not allowed to build up reserves for loan losses in good times. So the Fed was taking a lot of criticism for its regulatory policies, and then during the crisis, things got out of control. So the Fed was taking even more heat for that. I think that the Fed's main interest in the Dodd-Frank proceeding was in not being wiped out as a regulatory agency, because that was clearly threatened. And the Fed came out of it in the end in pretty good shape in terms of its regulatory authority. In fact, it probably gained a little authority.
So what? Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but we shouldn't be worried about what happens to the FDIC or the Fed or the controller of the currency or the SEC. What we ought to be worried about is what is the right thing to do for the country and for our financial system. How do we restructure these agencies so that we don't keep on having crisis after crisis? I mean, I've been in this business for about 40 years, Kathleen, and I've seen 3 major banking crises.
Okay, you've got about a minute left. And
Okay.
people who are listening, maybe some of them are, well, a lot of them I know work on Wall Street. Maybe some of them will even write their congressmen. A lot of my listeners I know are very concerned about the banking system. What's the number one thing that needs to be done? You pose the question, what needs to be done?
Well, I think first of all, I would definitely do what Senator Dodd wanted to do in November of 2009 when he said, "Let's consolidate the financial regulatory agencies into a new independent agency with a bipartisan 5-member board, and then I would create a real systemic risk council to oversee that system, provide oversight on it, not one that's run by the agencies themselves, as Dodd-Frank came up with. I would also look at, we have to address the housing policies in the country. We also have to deal with too big to fail and consider how much consolidation we're willing to have in our financial system."
Well, Bill Isaac, are you going to watch TV tomorrow, watch all this going on?
I'm not so sure. It frustrates me when I
that's
watch
good.
all that.
Then you can listen to Bloomberg Radio instead.
I think I'll do that.
Okay. Thanks so much, Bill Isaac. We'll talk to you soon.
.com/Tom Keene. And listen to the Hayes Advantage weekdays at noon Eastern on Bloomberg 1130 in New York or on Sirius and XM Satellite Radio Channel 113. Copyright 2011 Bloomberg LP.